safe start to the week. I'd like to talk about some of the economic data that came in at the end of last week, but before we do, let's hit that record button.
This meeting is being recorded.
And get started. Okay then, so last week we got some important data at the end of the week that I thought was important to talk about. So here, on Thursday, we got two important data points. We saw a big drop in initial jobless claims and a big jump in retail sales. And as you see here, I've given you the headlines, again, citing U.S. unemployment claims sinking to the lowest, to a pandemic low of 576,000, which, as we've discussed, is an enormous number. During good times, we know that when the economy is stronger, healthier, people are always moving in and out of the labor markets. We normally see upwards of 150 to 200,000 people moving in and out of the labor markets every month in a normal, healthy economy. In an economy that's under stress, we see these extraordinary numbers that we've seen over the course of the last year since the COVID pandemic took hold. But we're seeing improvement because there was a big fall off over the course of the previous week, as you see here for the week of April 10th at 576K. Also retail sales, we see a big jump in retail sales of almost 10%. That includes cars. If you take the cars out, it's about it's about 1% lower. It's about 8.8%. Still an enormous jump in retail sales, which all confirms what? That people are beginning to spend again. People are beginning to venture out as confidence begins to return to consumers and a sense of safety that the vaccine program is well underway and that people are getting vaccinated and that we are moving closer and closer to a full solution for the country. So that's all very positive. On Friday, we saw some building numbers come out. We saw here in the US, we saw building permits are up significantly and housing starts were up significantly. The headline was new home construction rebounds as the U.S. faces housing shortage. Can anyone add some color on that? What is that housing shortage about? Can anybody tell us? There's a shortage of inventory. Why is there a shortage of inventory? Because there's been so much buying. In a low rate environment where consumers are lining up to buy, the likelihood is that contractors feel more confident to build ahead of demand than they would otherwise. And so that's what we're seeing, is we're seeing confidence in the housing markets as indicated by the building permits and housing start data we got on Friday. And finally, the consumer sentiment index, which came in, that shows a jump in consumer sentiment to the highest it's been since the pandemic began last February, March. Also, a very strong takeaway. All of that being said, with all of these positive data points coming in, we know that it's not a straight line to here and success, that there are potential pitfalls along the way. The most significant being any delay in successful vaccination for the whole country. Right now, we're about 25% of the population that's been fully vaccinated. We need to be about 75 or 80% to be at what's called herd immunity, where we can get rid of those masks and start going back to things as they were. That looks like probably 6 or so months away, and hopefully we'll get there. But of course, there are some reasons to be concerned because there are some folks that are opting out of the vaccine. And therefore it might take a little bit longer, but we know that we're on the right track, and this data confirms that. The final point that I put here in terms of data points from last week was the note about China. I'm sure some of you have already talked about that in other classes, or certainly came across that data point through your own work over the course of the since last week when we met on Wednesday. China's Q1 economy grew by 18.3%. Versus the contraction in the first quarter of 2020 of something like 6.8 or 7%. So we're seeing a huge jump in economic growth in China, which confirms once again what we've talked about before, which is China which exerts an enormous amount of control within its borders, was able to exercise that level of control to get a tremendous adherence to the coronavirus regulations and to, along with extraordinary support from the Chinese government to support the economy, you have had what is no less than a gangbuster start to the 2020 to the year 2021, and important because of China's role in the global economy. Are there any comments or questions on this data before we move forward? No. Okay. Okay. So if you look here, what do we see? We see in the upper left-hand corner, we see indicated the RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that was established by China to counter the U.S. The U.S.-led 12-nation Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we've talked about before, that was 7 years in the making, and which President Trump pulled out of shortly after taking office in 2017. What was the idea of TPP? Can anyone tell us just briefly? Can anyone tell us what Trans-Pacific Partnership, what the objective was? Andrew, can you tell us? Okay. Alec?
Professor, was it to get maybe some trading partners in the Pacific Islands?
Well, that's exactly right. The idea was to put the U.S. in the center of the most important economy in the 21st century, along the Pacific Rim. And so, for example, the U.S. sells products, U.S. producers sell into nations throughout the Pacific Rim. So we're talking about Vietnam and Malaysia. For example, Vietnam is has a strong emerging middle-class economy that, of course, U.S. producers would love to sell their goods and services to. Tariff rates in Vietnam are particularly high. They go upwards of 70%. We've talked about how some nations use tariffs and non-tariff barriers to generate revenue. Vietnam is one of those countries. By joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, all of those tariffs and non-tariff barriers would have been eliminated for U.S. producers. It's upwards of 18,000 tariffs and non-tariff barriers that would have been eliminated for U.S. producers under the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and put U.S. producers in, as we said, the most important economic region for the 21st century. And in addition, to raise standards for worker rights and for intellectual property rights and for environmental standards in the region, acting as leverage against China. Effectively saying, if you want to participate in trade in the 21st century in a modern trading system, there are certain rules and obligations that you have to abide by. Now, of course, we have the World Trade Organization tries to accomplish this. This is another lever that the U.S. devised to not only aid or to assist its own domestic producers, but also to try to exert influence in, as we've said, such an important region of the world. That was canceled, and that was canceled by President Trump. And in the aftermath, where are we today? Well, so you have RCEP here that includes all of the countries listed here, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. This represents about 30% of global GDP, all of these countries, which is about $41 trillion. It also represents about 28% of the global population, or according to my notes, 2.2 billion people. So it's an enormous common market in which all of the tariffs and non-tariff barriers are eliminated between the members of the common market. If you look up here in the right-hand corner, what you see here is you see the Comprehensive Progressive Agreement. This is what followed the Trans-Pacific Partnership when the U.S. exited, in, that should say February 2017, not February 2016. We'll correct that before we put those slides up tonight. If you look at these 11 countries here, from Australia to Vietnam, these 11 countries, along with the U.S., was what made up the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So what's the only thing missing from the existing group of nations is the US, because the US pulled out of this very important organization. Finally, we have the Association of Southeast Asian Nations on the bottom, which includes nations, as you see, from Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Myanmar, down to Vietnam. And as I note here, ASEAN promotes economic, political, and security cooperation throughout the region for the member nations, in which, of course, tariffs and non-tariff barriers are eliminated on a mutual basis. What do you see among these three circles about the nations that appear? Do you see a lot of overlap among the nations?
Yes.
Yes, you see a lot of overlap among nations, and as we embark on material that talks about regional trading relationships, the importance of regional trading relationships, both from an economic and geopolitical perspective, I thought it'd be interesting to start here. So if we move on from here, we see what? You see, put these three circles together, and what do you see? You see that RCEP, which is also referred to as ASEAN +5. So it's all of the ASEAN nations +5, China, South Korea, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, make up RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that's led by China. I point out the stats up here, 30% of global GDP and 28% of the population. And then you have the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership that includes all the original TPP members, less the United States. Looking further, what do we see? We see that all the nations pointed to with the blue arrow are nations that were originally signed to the TPP before it was canceled in 2017. Excuse me for the phone. Okay, excuse me. On the right-hand side of the screen here, you see all the nations that are part of that were part of TPP. As I point out here, comparing RCEP, the Chinese-led version of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which represented 30% of global GDP, TPP represented 40% of global GDP, or $55 trillion, and only 12% of the global population of 850 million people. And its objective, as stated within its mandate, was to boost exports, economic growth, job creation, improve worker rights, strengthen environmental protections, and of course, intellectual and real property rights. In China's version of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, none of those things appear because China's version of trade is statist, it's mercantilist, and we've studied mercantilism. Again, and doesn't include any of those objectives that were written into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They do appear, though, within the CPTPP, which is the revised version of TPP, less the United States. What I wanted you to see was that there are nations that participate in multiple regional trading relationships. And in the case of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, what the U.S. did that's so serious is that it's left the playing field and left the playing field wide open to China. And of course, what did China do over the course of the 4 years of the Trump administration was to try to mine every possible opportunity to strengthen its hand, whether it means investing in Africa or investing in Western Europe or beefing up the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership as the leading regional trading relationship in Asia. So from here, let's move on and let's talk about the path of economic integration and what that looks like, okay? As we go from a free trade area like NAFTA, where you see the US with Mexico and Canada establishing a free trade area back in 1984, moving along towards the European Union, which represents an economic union back in 1992, which includes the free movement of goods and services and labor between the member nations, which is not what we see under a free trade area. So What defines a free trade area? Well, a free trade area is defined by tariffs and NTBs are removed among member nations, and member nations like the US, Canada, and Mexico each maintain their own trade restrictions against non-members, right? So among the three members of NAFTA, which is now the USMCA, or the original NAFTA, there's mutual elimination of tariffs and non-tariff barriers, but each nation maintains its own trade policy relative to all the other nations of the world. And I cite for you 1984 NAFTA as an excellent example. The next stage of economic integration is a customs union.
Professor?
Yeah.
We may have an issue here. I think we're all stuck at the three circles still. I don't know if you have moved on in the slides.
Well, then there's a problem. Thanks for the heads up.
No problem.
All right. Did everybody see this?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so we talked about a free trade area, the path of economic integration. How do we go from a free trade area like NAFTA, which has now been rechristened the Mexico USMCA, to the European Union, which is a much more comprehensive economic union, much more comprehensive regional partnership, where you see not just the elimination of tariff barriers, but you see the movement of goods, services, and most importantly, labor among the member nations. But we'll get to that in a moment. So first, we talked about a free trade area. We see the elimination of tariffs and non-tariff barriers among the member nations, but the member nations themselves, the US, Canada, Mexico, each maintain their own trade policy relative to all the other nations of the world. Next, we have in the path of economic integration, a customs union, where you see tariffs and non-tariff barriers have been removed among the member nations, and there is a common external trade policy against non-members. So after World War II, we see what is the roots of the European Union that really came into being in 1992 with the Maastricht Treaty, but I'm getting ahead of myself. In 1948, we see the formation of a customs union. Can anyone tell us what Benelux stands for?
Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg.
Pardon me?
Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg.
It sure does, Nicole. Thank you very much. That's exactly right. It's Benelux is the shorthand, the acronym for Belgium's, Netherlands, and Luxembourg that formed the original customs union that eventually evolves and morphs into what we now know as the modern EU. Following customs union and the path of economic integration, we have a common market. So where are we now? We've got all the characteristics of a free trade area and a customs union, but we also begin to see the free movement of goods, services, and production factors among the member nations. So again, tariffs and NTBs, non-tariff barriers have eliminated between the member nations. There's a common external trade policy among the member nations, and the free movement of goods, services, and labor, production factors, or labor among member nations. In the next stage, we have an economic union where you see what? You see everything, all the characteristics of a free trade area, a customs union, and a common market, but you also see unified tax, monetary, and fiscal policies that is set by some supranational institution or monetary authority. What's the trick, though, with an economic union? We talk about the problems that faced countries in Western Europe during the Great Recession, poor southern countries in Western Europe, right, that weren't able to devalue their currencies. Why? Because they'd given up some autonomy over their fiscal and monetary policy to the European Union and cannot devalue their currency. And so it requires a transfer of economic sovereignty to some supranational authority. Here in the US, of course, we have the Federal Reserve, and in Europe, you have the European Monetary Union, or EMU. Finally, the highest form of economic integration is a monetary union, which is Is everybody with me now here?
Yes, economic union.
Right. So next is monetary union, which is the most complete stage of economic integration that requires unification of monetary, fiscal, social policies, plus a common currencies. So when you look at the US, what do you see? You see 50 states that are linked with a common currency, a central bank that conducts monetary policy, federal government that conducts fiscal policy, national defense, and international affairs. So we've seen how nations can move from a free trade area as we see with NAFTA, all the way on to a monetary union here in the US. And just before that would be the EU with an economic union and the common market and economic union as seen within the EU. Any questions here? Good. So we talk about economic integration. What are we talking about? We're talking about the process of eliminating restrictions on international trade, payments, and production factor mobility, chiefly labor, the resources of production, but most specifically labor. So we talk about trade liberalization. It can either be on a non-discriminatory or on a discriminatory basis. If it's on a non-discriminatory basis, then all the participating nations agree to tariff reductions by any two nations are extended to all member nations. And we see that with GATT, which was introduced after World War II, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, and the World Trade Organization. In fact, GATT is the precursor to the World Trade Organization. Excuse me, just a moment. Trade liberalization can also be on a discriminatory basis, where nations are forming preferential trading arrangements with tariff reductions limited to only the member nations. And so the examples I give you are NAFTA and the European Union. When we talk about regional trading relationships, since World War II, we say that advanced nations have lowered trade restrictions through multilateral and regional trading relationships. The multilateral trading arrangements, you see your reciprocal reduction of trade barriers on a non-discriminatory basis. And then you see regional trading relationships where you have a small group of nations like you would see under the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, the European Union, NAFTA. We have a smaller group of nations that agree to lower trade barriers within the group and exclude all non-member nations. When we talk about the motivation for regional trading relationships, we focus on four issues. The objective to enhance economic growth and scale economies, to facilitate or make possible specialization, increasing specialization based upon comparative advantages, and exchange of knowledge between nations, which is critically important. Also, regionalism is a phenomenal way to attract direct foreign investment from other nations that are part of the partnership. So think about the free trade area of NAFTA, yes? And all of the hundreds of billions of dollars that have been invested in Mexico as a result of NAFTA that has led to the creation of a low-cost labor platform here in North America that is used by all the major industrial producers here in North America, as well as every major car producer around the world to access the US market so close by. And finally, regionalism is a way to strengthen economic reforms, as we talked about before, that one of the big motivating or catalysts behind the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the Obama administration was the idea of not only putting the US in the center of the action in Asia, but also to act as a force for good, a force for positive reform, to strengthen the forces of reform, to gain 1 billion consumers for or 2 billion consumers for our goods and services, but also strengthen the forces of reform, whether it's for labor, for the environment, or intellectual property rights, so on and so forth. And finally, we talk about the path of economic integration in Western Europe. We say that since the end of World War II, the objective has been the elimination of tariffs and non-tariff barriers, a movement towards more liberalized trade with the creation of some type of common or single European market based on uniform regulations. Let's take a look at some of the important dates that signify key moments in the path of economic integration in Europe. So in 1947, 23 nations signed the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is a multilateral agreement regulating global trade, and a phenomenal effort by the nations who had just fought this tremendous world war to maintain peace. And the general consensus was that it was through trade that we would establish a lasting peace. Excuse me. So these are the 23 nations. Pardon me. These are the 23 nations that signed the original GATT agreement. And until 1994, that remained in place until the Uruguay round agreement, where 123 nations signed an agreement in 1994 to establish the World Trade Organization, eliminating tariffs and non-tariff barriers, which remains its core purpose, to act as a force for good in the global community, to help adjudicate problems between member nations by serving as an objective intermediary, but also to achieve truly liberalized trade through the elimination of tariffs and non-tariff barriers. In 1948, as we said before, you have Benelux. So you've got the first customs union coming out of World War II that includes Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. And following in 1951, you have one of three critical agreements in the formation of the European Union. There was 1951, 1957, and then again in 1992. We see the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951 in the Treaty of Paris that includes the Benelux nations, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, along with France, Germany, and Italy, establishing the ECSC, that was a regulatory body put in place to control industrial production among member nations, which objective was mostly what? To prevent war, to prevent member nations from assembling enormous munitions that would enable it to launch war among any of its nations in the aftermath of World War II. So 1951, we have the Treaty of Paris, establishing the ECSC. It also provided a key framework for the development of the European Union. And then in 1957, we have the Treaty of Rome. Again, it's Benelux plus France, Germany, and Italy, which establishes the six-nation bloc becomes the European Union with the goal of more trade liberalization across the continent. So we see that over the course of 10 years, Benelux has been enlarged to six nations and has now become what is the precursor to the European Union. In 1968, a free trade area was established for the six-nation bloc that becomes the EU. In 1970, it becomes a customs union. In 1970, it becomes a customs union. Excuse me. In 1971, we see the gold standard ends. The gold standard, which was the gold standard ends in 1971, and foreign exchange begins to float in 1973. Let's look a little closer at that. In 1971, Richard Nixon closed the gold window, and paper money was no longer redeemable for gold. So the US dollar was first backed by gold, and then since then backed by the full faith and credit of the US government. What was the principal reason why Nixon closed the gold window? Can someone tell us?
Not enough gold in the treasury.
Oh, no.
Thanks, Andrew. That's exactly right. There wasn't enough gold. So that leads to the end of the gold standard. And again, in 1973, we see that the Great British pound begins to float, and that's where we get LIBOR, the London Interbank Offered Rate, which has persisted to this day. And if things go along the way they're supposed to, at the end of this year, we're going to see the introduction of the Secured Overnight Funding Rate, or SOFR. But again, 73, we see the pound float and the introduction of LIBOR. 1985, the timetable was established among the EU nations to become a common market with the elimination of all non-tariff barriers and the free movement of resources among member nations by 1992. In 1992, we see the Maastricht Treaty signed, which becomes the foundational document for the European Union, setting a date of 2002 for the actual monetary union, when it would become the 19-nation common market with the goal of unifying defense, currency, and citizenship policies. The Maastricht Treaty also established a commitment to further integration via common economic and monetary union, plus an alignment of economic and monetary policies. This is where things become a bit interesting, because members, to be a member, you have to meet the convergence criteria that's established under the EU Growth and Stability Pact, which has 4 key components with regard to price stability, interest rates, exchange rates, and deficits. So in order to be a member, a nation's inflation can't be greater than 1.5% above the average of the 3 lowest inflation rates in the union of member nations. Interest rates can't be greater than 2% above the average rates of the 3 lowest member nations in the union. The nation cannot have undertaken any type of devaluation for 2 years before joining. And finally, deficits can't be less than 3%, and debt can't be it should say debt is greater than 60%. We'll fix that.
Professor,
Thank you. I'm sorry?
Professor, what in the first point, the price stability?
They're both symbols are wrong. It should say deficits can't be greater than 3% and debt can't be greater than 60% of GDP. We're going to fix that for you.
No, I mean, what if the inflation is negative in price stability? Inflation should not be 1.5%. What if the 3 lowest union have a negative inflation? Does it still hold?
I'm thinking that through.
Okay. It's
My
okay.
answer is yes, it still holds. My answer is yes, it still holds.
Thank you.
So in 2002, finally, what do we get? The introduction of the European Union. I was in Europe when I was living in Europe when the euro was announced, and there were a lot of parties all over Europe. It was very exciting, a lot of fireworks. I'm not so sure that it's lived up to all of its hype, but it was a good effort to throw a party for a new currency. So that was 2002. We see the introduction of the euro debut, and the European Central Bank, which now controls euro supply, short-term interest rates, and fixed rates for member nations. Very much like we see the Federal Reserve playing the role of a central bank for the member nations, which is why member nations have, as we've said before, had to relinquish part of their sovereignty, their economic sovereignty, in order to be a member of the European Union, along with the other rules and regulations of the European Union, which includes the free movement of labor and other production resources among the member nations. One of the things that led to Brexit, which was the UK's desire to have all the good things that were offered by the European Union, and maybe not so many of the things that they considered to be negative, like a huge influx of labor that was willing to work at prices lower than existing citizens of the UK. There's the example of the Polish plumber who comes to the UK through Brexit, through the European Union, the Schengen Agreement, which allows free travel among members of citizens in the member nations, and is willing to work for a fraction of what somebody was living in the UK for many years before the European Union was willing to pay. But that's the price of being part of the Union. If any of you have been following the vaccine news, there's a problem with vaccine supplies in Europe. And one of the problems is vaccines going to the UK, which have been effectively curtailed or stopped by the EU. What is the EU saying? Can anyone tell us about those vaccine shipments going to the UK, what the response of the EU has been as the UK demands more access to their vaccines? The response of the EU has been, you're not part of the EU anymore. You have to wait. That's been the response of the EU when they've vaccinated their population satisfactorily. When they have more they can share, they'll be happy to share it, just like the United States. Excuse me. Any questions, comments, thoughts, observations? Okay. Well, so let's talk about the thing that we all love to look at, which are the welfare effects of regional trading relationships, okay, which is really the meat of the lesson this evening. You've got the trade, you've got static effects, which are the short-term production efficiencies and consumer welfare that include the trade creation and the trade diversion effect. The trade creation effect is when the domestic production of one customs union member is replaced by another member's low-cost imports. We see increasing welfare via the production and consumption effects, which lead to increasing specialization based on comparative advantage. So trade creation is a good thing. On the other hand, the trade diversion effect is when we see imports from a low-cost supplier outside the union are boxed out or replaced by a higher-cost supplier within the union. That represents falling welfare. So we have the static effects of a regional trading relationship, pardon me, and then, of course, the dynamic effects, which represents long-term growth through the creation of larger market, greater factor efficiencies, through the elimination of tariff barriers and restrictions, which, of course, do what? It encourages competition and it restricts monopoly power. Dynamic gains represent a movement towards more open markets. And what do? They offset the unfavorable static welfare effects of regional trading relationships, which we observe in the trade diversion effect. Dynamic welfare gains include the following: economies of scale, which we've talked about, greater competition, stimulus for investment, direct foreign investment, accelerated technical product progress, and of course, increased productivity. So let's take a look here. What do we see here? We see the market for grain in Luxembourg. We see the demand for Luxembourg, the supply for Luxembourg. We see here the supply of the US, the supply of Germany, the supply of the US plus a tariff, and the supply of Germany plus a tariff. So let's see. So what we know is that Luxembourg can't influence global prices. They're a price taker. They're a small nation, and they face a perfectly elastic supply curve from the US and from Germany. So the US can supply Luxembourg at $3 a bushel, and Germany can supply at $3.25 a bushel. So who are they going to buy from? They're going to buy from the US, who's a low-cost supplier. So what do we see in free trade? At $3 a bushel, Luxembourg is going to demand 23 bushels. They're going to produce 1 bushel, and they're going to import 22 bushels. If there are any questions on this, please let me know.
They will import all the bushels from the US, right?
Well, sure they would, because the US is the low-cost producer. Why am I going to buy even 1 bushel from Germany if they're charging me a quarter more per bushel? I won't. I'm going to buy it all for the US. So, good question. Luxembourg next levies a tariff of 50 cents a bushel on grain imports. That means the US price becomes $3.50 and the German price becomes $3.75. Under the tariff, well, the US is still the low-cost supplier, but demand is going to shrink, domestic production is going to increase, and imports are going to shrink. We know that already without even having to, before we even plot out the graph. But what do we see? We see that overall demand shrinks from 23 to 17 bushels, supply increases 6 bushels to 7, and imports fall from 22 to 10 bushels. In our next case, what happens? Look over here, we see that Luxembourg has formed a customs union with Germany without the United States, so that mutual tariffs are eliminated between Germany and Luxembourg. So what happens is that Germany becomes the low-cost supplier, boxing out the world's low-cost supplier, the United States. So with the customs union formed, Germany becomes the low-cost supplier at 325. And so demand increases from under the tariff adjusted demand to 20 bushels. The new supply the new supply shrinks to 4 bushels, and overall imports increase from 10 bushels to 16 bushels. Are there any questions here? The US was the low-cost supplier. Luxembourg forms a partnership with Germany. That 50-cent tariff disappears on Germany's wheat because now they're a member of a partnership, a regional trading partnership with the customs union with Luxembourg. And therefore, what's happened is great for Luxembourg consumers because why? They're no longer paying $3.50, they're paying $3.25. But it's not as good as it could be because they're paying $3.25, they're not paying $3. So we can map the welfare effects of this regional trading partnership just as we've done before. And what do we see? We see you have the production effect, which is the lower cost is a favorable gain. They're not paying the tariff-induced price of $3.50, they're paying $3.25. Then you see the increased consumption. They're not, the tariff-induced demand was at 17. Now, in the absence of the tariff, at $3.25 a bushel, they're buying 20 bushels of grain. However, so we have the trade creation effect, which is the domestic production of one member of the union, which is Luxembourg, that produces wheat at a very high price, is being replaced by the low-cost supplier within the union, which is Germany. There's a big but, though. What's the but? Is that you've displaced the world's low-cost supplier. So that's your trade diversion effect, because the low-cost supplier, the U.S., has been diverted, or the low-cost supplier has been replaced by a higher-cost supplier within the union, which is Germany. So if A plus B is greater than C, then that means there's an overall welfare gain. If A plus B is less than C, then that means there's an overall welfare loss. And if A plus B equals C, then it means that there's a wash. There's neither welfare gain or welfare loss. So in this case, what do we see? That world production has been reorganized less efficiently with the customs union in place, representing a negative welfare loss. Are there any questions here? Okay. So again, if A plus B is greater than C, you have a positive trade creation effect offsetting your negative trade diversion effect, and that's all. Any questions? For class on Wednesday, I'd like you to do in chapter, just bear with me for a second, please. I'm just grabbing the text real quick. For class on Wednesday, in chapter 8, which you should have read. In class Wednesday, in chapter 8, in the homework questions, please do number 6. Question number 6 for class on Wednesday, which we're going to go through. It's a mapping problem, just like the one we went through now. And it regards the supply and demand for gloves in the country of Portugal, the nation of Portugal. I'd like you to do that problem. It's a multi-part problem for class on Wednesday. I'm going to do it too, and we're going to go through that together in class on Wednesday. Now, we're going to put regional trading relationships aside, and we're going to take a look at some arbitrage. Okay? So let's go ahead and, yeah.
Before we go over it, so in this, the difference here is that the C, it's been taken by the union.
Well, what C is, in other words, all that C represents is that you were paying, let's look at that. It's a very good question. We originally, Luxembourg consumers were originally paying $3 $3 for a bushel of grain. Yes? Mm-hmm. Right? And then with the tariff, it went up to $3.50. Then the customs union was formed, and consumers are now buying German wheat at a price of $3.25. But that's still lower than the $3.50 that U.S. grain would be priced at, because it's subject to the tariff as a non-member of the customs union. So we can quantify the welfare effect of the fact that consumers in Luxembourg are paying $3.25 instead of $3. It's the lowest price within the customs union, but it's not the lowest world price. Do you see?
Yeah.
We went from $3 to $3.50 back to $3.25. We're no longer paying what we were paying in free trade. At free trade, we were paying $3 a bushel, then went to $3.50. Now we're back at $3.25, right?
And this is because of the union, right?
That's exactly right. Germany formed a customs union with Luxembourg. Therefore, there's no tariff. So they are now the low-cost supplier within the customs union. Do you see that?
Yeah, just to confirm, this is only for small countries, or?
No, it's for all countries. This is the US and Germany. These are not small countries. In this case, Luxembourg happens to be a small nation. They're a price taker. In this case, it's a small nation that's a price taker from two larger nations. But there are welfare effects whether or not there's a small nation or a large nation. We plotted the welfare effects of a small nation facing a tariff and a large nation facing a tariff. Okay?
Thank you.
Do you understand C, how we got to C?
But based on what I'm understanding is that it's because of the union. And
it is because of the union. In other words, here we were at free trade, right? At free trade, we're buying at $3 a bushel. It's great. We're not going to buy at $3.25. Now there's a tariff after free trade. We're still the low-cost supplier. There's no customs union. So they're buying not at $3, but at $3.50. Now, because of the customs union, of which the U.S. is not a member, Germany becomes the low-cost provider at $3.25. But you, as a citizen of Luxembourg, you're happy because you're not paying a tariff-induced price of $3.50. But you, the Luxembourg consumer, you remember the good old days when you were just paying $3 a bushel, when you were just trading with the United States, you were buying U.S. Grain at $3 a bushel. But because of the customs union, the U.S. is no longer able to export into the Luxembourg market tariff-free. Germany, however, is, and therefore has a 25-cent advantage over the U.S. on every bushel of grain. And we can quantify the effect of that. Going from a tariff-induced price, yes, we can show that moving from a tariff-induced price to a lower price as a result of the customs union formation results in a favorable welfare gain because it's a lower price, $3.50 to $3.25. There's also an increase in overall consumption. That's a favorable welfare gain. But getting back to your original question, there is, as we said, the imports from one low-cost supplier outside the union, the United States, have been diverted to a high-cost supplier in the union. The low-cost supplier has been displaced by the low-cost supplier in the union. That low-cost supplier is still a higher-cost supplier than the world's low-cost supplier.
Which is $3.25.
Yes.
Okay.
You got that?
Yeah, thank you.
Try that question number 6. I'm telling you, you'll see something like that in your final exam, which is a month away. There's no time like the present to, really work on this stuff. Work on question 6. This is for everybody for class on Wednesday, and we're going to go through that very carefully like we've done before, and it'll help you to absorb the information even better if you do it right away. Again, for Wednesday, question 6. Let's take a look at our hedging problem for the night. We're going to work on an arbitrage problem. So here, we've got the dollar trading against the pound at 83 cents. the euro trading against the pound at 0.83 cents, and the euro trading against the dollar at $1.33. The spot quote of the pound against the dollar in this case was $1.5867. The principal was 1 million. Because you have the currency pairs, euro, pound, euro, dollar. So the pound and the dollar both trading against the euro. What can we do? We can calculate the cross rate, the pound and the dollar, which is one of the things you're asked to do. Calculate the cross rate, pound, dollar, derive the inverse exchange rates, and tell me the potential dollar profit and return on investment if you started with principal of $1 million. We already know that there's an arbitrage opportunity because, well, I've told you so, and otherwise we wouldn't be doing the problem, but I want to see that you can calculate the cross rate. So first, let's do the inverted exchange rate on the dollar pound. Well, we know what the spot quote is on the dollar pound. Can someone tell me what's the inverse on the dollar, on the pound dollar? What is the dollar pound inverse exchange rate? I'm going to wait for someone to tell me.
1.6063.
No, but give it another shot. Just flip it over. 1.5867, flip it over. 0.6302. Yes? Has everybody got that?
Yes, I got it.
Good. That's exactly right. That's why we call it the inverse exchange rate. Now, let's do our calculated cross rate, pound to dollar. Can somebody tell me what that is?
Sorry, Professor, what was the calculation for the inverse exchange rate again?
Well, we know that the spot rate on the dollar pound is 1.5867. If we flip it over and say 1 over 1.5867, we get the dollar pound spot rate. That gets us 0.6302. Now to calculate the cross rate, we have to, for the pound dollar, we have to say how many times does the pound go into the dollar? So someone tell me what is the calculated cross rate?
0.6225.
1.6064. So 1.333 divided by 0.83. So the pound going into the dollar is 1.6064. So you see that the calculated cross rate is greater than the spot quote. Therefore, we know that there's an arbitrage opportunity. You already know that because I told you a principal of $1 million and because it's an arbitrage problem. But this is how you would know if you were working in the markets, because you would have derived the cross rate with these currency pairs, and you would have identified an opportunity. Now, what are you going to do? You're starting with £1 million, so you've got to trade as follows. Well, what are you going to do? You're going to sell pounds on the spot market for euros. You're going to sell euros for dollars, and then you're going to sell dollars back into pounds. So let's go through each step. You're going to divide the local currency by the local spot rate. So you said £1 million divided by 0.83 gives us euro 1,204,819. We've got to sell those for dollars. Well, we're going to multiply by the spot rate of 1.3333 to give us 1,606,385. And now, finally, we're going to sell dollars for pounds on the spot market. We're going to use our calculated cross rate. No, we're going to use our inverse exchange rate. Very important. Let's not make that mistake using your inverse exchange rate, because the inverse exchange rate is just the reverse of the spot rate. So you must use the inverse exchange rate, get you to points, get you to pound 1,012,344. So what's your profit here? 12,344 pounds, which at the current spot rate of 1.5867 gives you $19,586 worth of profit, which now we can tell 12,344 pounds on £1 million investment equals a 1.23% return. And that's it. Any questions? Okay, so let's pause for a second. I'm going to stop the share. And there you all are. And we're going to stop
The
recording.
recording has stopped.
Now we're going to go back to the share. We're going to go over the quiz. Okay? Quiz grades were posted last week. In general, the grades were very, what?
Sorry, I have a question. I just saw for the profit you put 12,344. Is it 1,012,000 or just
No, because look, it's a good question, but look here. You sold dollars for pounds, you ended up with 1,012,344. You started with £1 million. That means that your profit is 12,344.
I see.
Right?
Mhm.
And you could say 19,586 over 1,204,819. That's going to get you the same 1.23%. You can calculate the ROI either way using the dollar value of the profit or the pound value of the profit, the 19 and change versus the 12.3 and 12 and change.
Okay.
You understand?
Yes, it is because we started with the 1 million.
Well, that's exactly right. That's it. Okay. That's exactly right.
I see. Thank you.
Good. Let's talk about the quiz. I think the grades in general were pretty good. I'd like to spend some time now before we close for the evening going over the quiz. And let's go on from here and let's take a look. So the question was asking you, the figure illustrates the television market for Mexico, a small country unable to affect world price. The supply and demand in Mexico indicate the supply and demand schedules. Consider that Japan can supply televisions to Mexico at $100 a set. So this is what you were shown. What'd you do? Well, at $100 a set, free trade, we know that you've got a demand of 24 televisions, a supply of 4 televisions, and import to 20 TVs. If there are any questions as we go through this, let me know. So our free trade price is $100 a set. So we can plot very easily our consumer surplus, which comes in at 7,200, and our producer surplus, which comes in at 200. Excuse me. Next, the question says, suppose the governments of Mexico and Japan negotiate a VER, which is just like a quota, in which Japanese TV exports to Mexico are limited to 8 units. So Mexico and Japan negotiate a VER limiting Japanese exports to Mexico to 8 units at the price of $250 a unit. So here we go. Here's what the map looks like. We went from 4 units plus 8 gives us 12. We drew this line. We drew the line across. This is where price is at 250. The price is at 250. So we know that domestic production has increased to 10. Demand has fallen to 18, and imports have fallen to 8. So if we want to plot the welfare effects, we have our redistributive effect. We just take the area of the triangle and the square, gives us 1,050. The protective effect, which is the result of increased production, we get 450. The revenue effect, which accrues to anybody that can sell in a protected market, gets us 1,200. And the consumption effect, which represents reduced consumption, was 450. The overall welfare loss is your protective effect, your revenue effect, and your consumption effect, or $2,100. Any questions here? Okay. So let's look next. You were given The figure above illustrates revenue and cost conditions for ABC Company, which sells calculators in Canada and France. So what do we know? We're looking at non-discriminatory versus discriminatory sales. And we're said, as a non-discriminating seller, what's happening? Well, we know that the company is going to maximize its profit, producing and selling where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So we know they're going to sell 27 calculators at $5 a unit. That's $135 less the average total cost per unit of $3 a unit times your 27 calculators gets your $81. So you have your revenue less your cost gives you a profit of $54. That was it. Next, the question is, what do things look like what are they selling in each market? So they're selling in each market at the same price. So at $5, they're selling 21 units in Canada, and they're selling 6 units in France. Okay? Again, we get to our $54 profit. Now, what happens as a price discriminating seller? Well, they're going to charge the higher price in the less elastic market, which is Canada, and a lower price in the more elastic market, France. We're going to find the optimal output and price, where the horizontal line here intersects the marginal revenue schedule at $2, right? Where your marginal revenue equals your marginal cost. Well, in each submarket, where are we in Canada? At $2, we're going to sell, in Canada, we're going to sell 15 units at $7 a piece. And in France, we're going to sell 12 units at $4 a piece, which gives us a total profit revenue of $153 less the same average total cost of $3 a unit times 27 gives us our 81. Means we've booked a $72 profit versus a $54 profit as a non-discriminating seller. So the answer is there's a difference of $18 with price discrimination. Okay. And finally, the question was here, the figure illustrates the steel market for Mexico, a small country unable to affect world price. The world price of steel is $200 per ton, and the Mexican steel industry is able to obtain trade protection from the government. So let's look at $200 a ton. Demand is 8 tons, supply is 2 tons, and imports are 6 tons. Consumer surplus was easy enough at 3,200, and producer surplus also easy enough at 200. Now he says that Mexico provides domestic producers a subsidy of $200 a ton. That means their final price is whatever their retail price is of $200 plus 200. That gets them to 400. So at 400, we draw a line up, we draw a line down. What happens? Imports go from shrink from 6 tons to 4 tons as domestic production increases from 2 tons to 4 tons. What does the subsidy cost? Well, 4 tons times 200 gives you your $800 cost for the subsidy. As a result of the subsidy, Mexican steel producers gain what? Well, they gain their producer surplus, the transfer consumer surplus. So that's got you, the area of that is your square plus your triangle gets us our $600 transfer consumer surplus to more efficient consumers. We know that there's no consumption effect, which remains the same. The next question was, as a result of the subsidy, the welfare loss to Mexico due to inefficient domestic production equals $200, which is the protective effect there. As more costly output, domestic output replaces foreign inputs. The overall deadweight welfare loss to Mexico is that $200 that we just cited. And here we say, suppose the Mexican government, excuse me, hold on, I've gotten ahead of myself. Right. Suppose the Mexican government imposes an import quota equal to 2 tons of steel. Well, here's your subsidy, here's your quota. If if Mexican steel importers behave as monopoly buyers and foreign exporters behave as competitive sellers, well, then of course the quota revenue is going to, the windfall profit's going to go to the Mexican steel importers. And so let's see, your redistributive effect we know is 600, your protective effect, your revenue effect, and of course you've got your consumption effect, because under a quota you're going to see a consumption effect. Your lost consumer surplus is ABCD, which is 1,400. The overall welfare loss to Mexico, if importers act as monopoly buyers, your protective effect plus your consumption effect, which is the 400. Why doesn't it include C? Because if Mexican producers act as monopoly sellers, and that means as monopoly buyers, that means what? That the windfall profit or quota rent is going to accrue to them. And then finally, the overall welfare loss to Mexico, if exporters act as monopoly sellers, it's going to be $800. B plus C plus D. Any questions here? Okay, good. Okay, folks. That's it for tonight. We're going to continue our discussion on regional trading relationships on Wednesday.